The coat landed on her shoulders like a verdict. Adeline Garrett stood in the howling white fury of the Colorado High Pass, her body shaking so hard her teeth clacked together in a rhythm that felt like Morse code for dying. And she stared at the man, who had just stripped the only barrier between himself and the January storm clean off his own back, and dropped it around her without a single word of explanation or apology. Cole Vance was already turning away from her, already walking back into the teeth of the wind, his broad shoulders in nothing but a cotton shirt rapidly disappearing into the curtain of driven snow. He was walking, just walking. No theatrics, no demand for gratitude, no waiting to see how she would receive the gesture. He was simply moving forward as if it cost him nothing, and she could see, even from 3 feet behind him, that it was costing him everything. She knew who he was. That was the thing that made her throat close around a sound that was half sob and half fury. She knew what he had done. She had ridden for 3 weeks through the Wyoming and Colorado territories with a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket that described Cole Vance in language that left nothing to the imagination. Dangerous. Wanted. Last seen in Denver City. Reward, $200, dead or alive. She had memorized the lines of his face from the crude sketch at the top of the wanted poster before she ever laid eyes on him. She had told herself, on every cold morning of that 3-week ride, that when she found him, she would feel nothing but righteous purpose. She had not anticipated the coat. She had not anticipated the smile. Because even as he walked away from her into the frozen dark, his back bared to a wind cold enough to kill, she could see it in profile when he turned his face slightly into the gale. The corner of his mouth lifted. Not a sneer. Not the bitter grimace of a man performing sacrifice for an audience. Just a quiet, private, almost baffled smile, like a man who had surprised himself and found the surprise pleasant. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders and started after him. She did not yet understand that she was already lost. 3 weeks earlier, the world had been a different and more manageable place. Adeline Garrett was 26 years old and had been managing unmanageable situations since she was 8, which was the year her father had been shot in a dispute over a land deed in the New Mexico territory. And her mother had concluded, with the quiet practicality of a woman who understood arithmetic, that 4 children and no income was a problem with only one solution. She had packed the children up and moved them to her sister's house in Laramie, Wyoming, and proceeded to take in laundry and mending until Adeline was old enough to become a schoolteacher and start contributing to the arithmetic herself. By 26, Adeline had been a schoolteacher in Laramie for 4 years. She was, by all accounts, exceptional at it. She was patient with the slow learners and exacting with the quick ones, and had a particular gift for making long division feel like a puzzle rather than a punishment. The children of Laramie liked her. Their parents respected her. The town council had, just last autumn, raised her annual salary by $5, which was not a large gesture but was, in Laramie, a significant one. She was not, in anyone's accounting, a woman who rode into the Colorado territories in the dead of January chasing a wanted criminal, which was exactly why no one knew she was doing it. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. It came from her youngest brother, Thomas, who was 23 and had gone west to Nevada the previous spring to try his luck at the silver mines. The letter was not from Thomas exactly. It was about Thomas. Adeline read the letter 4 times. Then she read it a 5th time. Then she folded it very carefully and put it in her coat pocket and went to teach her afternoon classes, because the children were expecting her, and life, she had learned at age 8, did not pause to accommodate crisis. But that evening, sitting at the small table in her small rented room with the letter unfolded in front of her and the lamp burning low because oil cost money, she did something she almost never did. She let herself feel the full weight of it. Thomas, who had her father's eyes and their mother's stubborn jaw, and who had taught himself to read by candlelight after everyone else was asleep, because he wanted to catch up to Adeline. Thomas, who wrote letters home every month without fail and who had saved for 2 years to buy their mother a new winter shawl. Thomas, sitting in a mountain jail while the Colorado winter closed in around him. 7 years. He would be 30 when he came out if he survived it. She had $40 in savings. Lawyers in Denver City did not work for $40. She needed someone who could navigate the territorial system without money. Someone with a different kind of currency. Someone who knew the right pressure points, and the right people, and the right moments to apply both. Which was how she had ended up, 11 days after the letter arrived, sitting in a saloon in Cheyenne, Wyoming, across a sticky table from a man named Lester Doyle, who was a bail bondsman and sometimes information broker, and who had a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. "You want leverage," Lester had said, not as a question. "I want options," Adeline had said. "I have a brother in a territorial jail and no money for a proper lawyer. I have heard that there are people in Colorado who operate outside the official channels and who might be persuaded to help if the situation was presented correctly." Lester had looked at her for a long moment over the rim of his whiskey glass. "You're a school teacher." "Yes," from Laramie. "Yes, and you rode to Cheyenne by yourself in January." "I took the train to Cheyenne," she said. "I am aware of my limitations. I will require a horse from here." Lester Doyle had laughed. It was not an unkind laugh. "All right, schoolteacher, I'll tell you what I know. There's a man who works the Colorado territories, goes by Cole Vance. He's not exactly what I'd call reputable, but he's got a history of getting people out of tight spots when the official system has failed them. Knows every judge and marshal from Denver City to Pueblo. Knows where the bodies are buried, both figuratively and, rumor has it, in a few literal cases as well. He's got a wanted poster out on him from a property dispute that went sideways 3 years back, but the marshal who issued it is more interested in keeping the peace than catching Cole Vance specifically, so it's more of a nuisance than a death sentence. He is a criminal, Adeline had said. He's a complicated man in a complicated territory, Lester had replied. The West don't really do clean categories, miss. You want clean categories, you should stay in Laramie. She had thought about Thomas. Where do I find him? She had asked. Cole Vance was 31 years old and had been a complication in other people's lives for long enough that he had stopped apologizing for it. He had been born in Virginia, the son of a tobacco farmer who was a decent man in most respects, but who had the particular blindness common to decent men of his era and region, which was a complete inability to see the institution of slavery as the catastrophic moral failure it was. Cole had grown up alongside the children of enslaved people on his father's farm, had played with them and learned from them and watched, as he got older, the full horror of what their lives actually were. And when the war had come, he had walked off his father's land at 17, lied about his age, and joined the Union side. He had not had a home in the conventional sense since. The war had done to him what it did to a great many young men who had gone into it believing in things, and come out the other side in possession of a much more complicated and considerably less comfortable understanding of the world. He had drifted west after the armistice, which was where drifting west men went. He had worked cattle drives, worked as a deputy in 2 different towns in Kansas before the politics of both situations had become untenable, worked as a guide for surveying parties moving through the mountain territories. He had acquired, along the way, a reputation for competence with firearms that he had not particularly sought, and a secondary reputation for using that competence with a certain degree of moral discretion that was, in the West of 1878, rarer than gold. He had ended up in Colorado partly by accident, and partly because the mountains suited something in him that he could not have named but recognized on sight. The high country had a quality of silence that the eastern world could not produce. Up in the passes, with the peaks above you and nothing but wind and stone and sky in every direction, you could hear yourself think without the noise of other people's expectations cluttering the signal. He lived in a small settlement called Redstone Flat, which was not a town so much as a collection of buildings that had agreed, through proximity and shared inconvenience, to constitute a community. He did odd work. He knew people. He occasionally helped people who had run out of other options, and he occasionally accepted money for it and occasionally did not. And the wanted poster from the property dispute 3 years back was, as Lester Doyle had accurately summarized, more of a nuisance than a genuine threat. He had not been planning on encountering a schoolteacher from Laramie on the mountain road in a January blizzard. He had not been planning on a lot of things. Adeline had found him 4 days after her conversation with Lester Doyle. She had ridden south from Cheyenne on a rented horse, a sturdy gray mare named, according to the livery stable owner, Prudence, which Adeline considered an encouraging sign. She had maps, a compass, enough food for a week, and the address of a trading post outside Redstone Flat, where Lester had told her Cole Vance occasionally collected mail. The trading post was a low, smoky building that smelled of pine resin and animal hide, and the particular human density of a place that served as community gathering point for people spread across 20 square miles of mountain terrain. The man behind the counter had no mail for Cole Vance and no particular knowledge of his whereabouts, but a woman mending harnesses in the corner had glanced up and said, without much ceremony, that Cole had been seen 2 days ago heading up toward the Maroon Valley settlement to sort out some trouble with a land claim. "How long does that kind of trip usually take?" Adeline had asked. The woman with the harnesses had looked at her with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating strangers in terms of their likelihood of surviving the wilderness. "Depends on the weather," she had said. "Weather's been holding. Maybe 2, 3 more days before he comes back through this way." Adeline had waited. She had paid for space in the trading post's back room, which contained 3 cots and a wood stove and was shared with a trapper named Elias and a Mexican trader named Rodrigo, who both ignored her with great dignity and made her feel, in their studied non-acknowledgement, surprisingly safe. She had eaten dried venison and hard bread, and read the same 2 issues of the Rocky Mountain News that someone had left by the wood stove until she had them practically memorized. On the evening of the 2nd day, Cole Vance had walked through the door. She had recognized him from the wanted poster, though the poster had not done him justice in any direction. He was taller than the sketch suggested, and broader through the shoulders, with a quality of stillness that was not passivity, but rather the controlled absence of unnecessary movement. The economy of a man who had learned to conserve energy and attention for the things that mattered. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes that were a complicated shade of gray-green that the poster's crude drawing had rendered as a single smudged dot. He had looked around the room once, in the way that people who had survived dangerous situations learn to look at rooms, cataloging exits and occupants and potential threats in a single practiced sweep. His gaze had landed on her and stayed there for exactly 1 second longer than it had stayed on anyone else before moving on. She had her hand in her coat pocket, touching the wanted poster. She had not taken it out. She had not, in 3 weeks of planning and 2 days of waiting, considered what she would actually say when she found him. She had imagined in the abstract a conversation, a negotiation, a transaction. She had imagined deploying information and making a case and arriving at an agreement. She had not imagined the specific reality of his presence, which had a weight to it that her preparations had not accounted for. He had ordered coffee from the man behind the counter, and then, without particular preamble, had said to the room in general, "There's a storm coming over the eastern pass tonight. Anyone who needs to be on that road should leave before dark." Then he had sat down at the table nearest the stove, and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, and stared into the middle distance with the expression of a man carrying on an internal conversation of some complexity. Adeline had looked at the darkening window and then at her maps and then at the man at the table, and she had made a decision that she later identified as the first truly impulsive thing she had done in her adult life. She had sat down across from him. "Mr. Vance," she had said. He had looked up. "My name is Adeline Garrett. I have a brother named Thomas in a territorial jail east of Denver City on a charge I have very good reason to believe is false, or at minimum grossly inflated by a system that was not designed to give fair treatment to young men of limited means who have no powerful advocates. I have been told you are someone who understands how to navigate that system through channels that are, I acknowledge, not strictly official. I would like to hire you to help get him out." She had watched his face during this speech. It had not changed much. There was a slight shift in his eyes, a quality of attention that sharpened, the way a man's focus sharpens when something unexpected has captured his genuine interest rather than just his surface awareness. "Who told you about me?" he had said. "A man named Lester Doyle in Cheyenne. Lester talks too much. On this occasion, I'm grateful that he does." Cole Vance had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had looked at his coffee. Then he had looked back at her. "I don't know your brother," he had said. "No, but I do. He did not steal anything. He is not the conspiring kind. He is the kind of young man who teaches himself to read by candlelight because he is trying to catch up to his older sister. And I will not sit in Laramie and watch him disappear into a federal labor system for 7 years because I could not find the right person to help me make the right case to the right people." Something moved behind his eyes, not pity. It was something more complicated and more interesting than pity. "What can you pay?" he had said. $40, she had said, "which I know is not enough. I am also, however, a woman with a skill set that may be of some use to you. I can read and write exceptionally well. I can keep financial records. I can draft documents and letters. I understand legal language. If there is work of that kind you need done, I will do it." Another long pause. "You rode down from Laramie alone," he had said. "I took the train to Cheyenne." "Still, my brother is in jail." He had nodded very slowly, as if absorbing something that had settled into a space he had not known was empty. "There's a storm coming," he had said again. "We'll talk more in the morning." The morning had confirmed the storm was worse than predicted. They had spent an additional day at the trading post, while the snow came down, with the kind of focused commitment that the Colorado high country brought to winter weather. Cole had talked to the man at the counter, who was named Hector and who seemed to be the de facto nerve center of information for the entire surrounding territory, and had come back with a thumbnail sketch of the situation that was considerably more detailed than anything Adeline had managed to piece together from Lester Doyle's second-hand account. Thomas Garrett had been working at a silver mine in the mountains east of Denver City, when 3 months of wages had gone missing from the company's strongbox. The mine owner, a man named Sutherland Price, had accused the newest workers, which in this case meant the poorest and least connected ones, Thomas among them. The territorial judge was a man named Aldous Fenwick, who had a long and documented relationship with Price's mining interests. "Fenwick is the problem," Cole had said, spreading a map on the trading post table and not looking at her while he talked, which she had already begun to notice was a habit. He gathered his thoughts while looking at other things. It was oddly restful to be around, after years of men who made a production of eye contact. He's not reachable through official channels because the official channels run through him. But there is a federal circuit inspector named Harold Briggs who has been building a case against Fenwick's relationships with the mining operations for about 18 months. If your brother's case can be presented to Briggs in a way that adds to that larger case, Briggs has motivation to intervene. "You know Briggs," Adeline had said. "I know people who know Briggs," Cole had said, "which is close enough." "So what is the plan?" He had looked up from the map then, directly at her, for one of those longer-than-necessary moments. "The plan is that we ride to Denver City when the weather clears. I arrange a meeting with an intermediary who can get word to Briggs, and you write me the best and most detailed account of your brother's situation that can be put on paper. Names, dates, everything you know and everything he told you in his letters." "I can do that," she had said. "I know you can," he had said, and he had gone back to looking at the map. The weather cleared enough on the following morning to travel, which in Colorado high country winter terms meant the snow had stopped actively falling, and the wind had dropped from murderous to merely brutal. Adeline had packed her saddlebag with the competent efficiency of a woman who had grown up understanding that warmth and food were not luxuries but calculations, and had led Prudence out of the trading posts, leaned to stable to find Cole already mounted on a black horse with a white star marking on its forehead, and a temperament that seemed, from the way it stood in the cold without complaint, to be roughly analogous to its riders. They had ridden for 3 hours in a companionable silence that was, Adeline noticed, not uncomfortable. She was accustomed to silences being something that had to be managed, filled or explained or apologized for. This one simply existed, and Cole Vance seemed entirely at home in it, and after the first 30 minutes, she had found herself relaxing into it as well. He rode slightly ahead of her, because he knew the road and she did not, and she had the leisure to observe him without the awkwardness of being observed in return. He sat a horse with the unthinking ease of someone who had spent years in the saddle, completely still at the top, feet loose in the stirrups, hands quiet on the reins. Occasionally, he would turn his head to scan the tree line on either side of the road, with that same measured, cataloging attention he had brought to the interior of the trading post, and she had the sense that he was not looking for anything in particular, but rather maintaining a general awareness of his surroundings that had become automatic, like breathing. "You were a lawman," she had said around the second hour. He had glanced back at her, not surprised, a little assessing. "Deputy, 2 different counties in Kansas." "What happened?" A beat of silence. "The first one, the sheriff decided I was too willing to enforce the law equally on people who felt the law shouldn't apply to them, and my tenure became untenable. The second one, roughly the same situation. That must have been frustrating." "It was clarifying," he said. "Showed me the limits of official channels. And the wanted poster," she had said. She had told herself she was asking for practical reasons, to understand the legal landscape she was operating in. She suspected this was not the only reason. He had not tensed. She had been watching for that. "Property dispute," he said. "Man named Hargrove was trying to push a family off land they'd legally settled. Widow woman and her 4 children. The official channels were being slow and Hargrove's men were being fast, and I made a choice about which one to support. Hargrove had enough political connections to get a warrant issued. Marshal Tully in Denver City has about as much interest in actually catching me as I have in being caught, because both of us understand that the warrant is more Hargrove's politics than actual justice. You helped a widow keep her land, Adeline had said, more or less, and received a criminal record for your trouble. That's about the size of it. She had thought about this for a moment, then she had said, the West really does not do clean categories. He had glanced back at her again, and that time she had caught the very beginning of a smile before he turned back to the road. Just a small one, brief as a match flame, but genuine. They had stopped at noon to rest the horses and eat a cold meal from their saddlebags, sheltering from the wind on the lee side of a rock formation that jutted from the hillside at a useful angle. Cole had produced a canteen of coffee that was still warm from the trading post's morning fire, and he had handed it to her first without any ceremony, and she had drunk and handed it back, and they had eaten dried beef and hard biscuits and looked at the white mountains in a silence that was beginning to feel, she thought with some alarm, like something she had had all her life and not known she was missing. "Tell me about Thomas," he had said. She had looked at him. He was not looking at her, was looking at the mountain line, but the quality of his attention was on her. "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me," he said. "I need to understand who I'm working for." So she had talked. She had told him about growing up in New Mexico, about their father's death, about Laramie and the laundry, and the mending, and the long years of careful arithmetic that had kept the family functional while she saved to go to teacher training. She had told him about Thomas specifically, about the way he had cried when she had left for teacher training, not because he was a soft boy, but because he understood what it had cost her and felt the weight of it. About how he had written her letters every month for 4 years, from Nevada and before that from Wyoming, letters that were full of plans and observations, and the particular eager intelligence of a young man trying to make something out of nothing through sheer force of attention. Cole had listened. That was the thing about him, she was discovering. He listened the way very few people listened, with his entire body quiet and his attention complete, not waiting for a pause in which to insert himself, but genuinely receiving what she was saying. It was a quality that, in her experience, was rare enough to be remarkable. "He sounds like someone worth helping," Cole had said when she finished. "He is," she had said. They had been back on the road for another hour when the second storm had come. It had come from the north, and it had come fast. The way the worst weather in the high country always came, without the polite warning of gradually darkening skies, but with a sudden, complete commitment. The wind switching direction, and the temperature dropping 8 degrees in 20 minutes, and the snow beginning to fall in sheets rather than flakes. Within 30 minutes of its arrival, the road ahead of them had become substantially less a road, and substantially more a theoretical concept, buried under 6 inches of new accumulation, with more arriving constantly. Cole had pulled up and turned in his saddle to look at her, and the expression on his face was the first one she had seen from him that contained anything she would have categorized as worry. "There's a way station another 4 miles east," he said. "If we push hard, we can make it before dark." "Can we make it?" she had said, because she was a practical woman and preferred direct questions. "Yes," he said. After a fractional pause, he added, "If the horses hold." They had pushed. Prudence was an excellent horse and held admirably. Cole's black gelding, whose name she had not yet learned, was equally stalwart. But horses in mountain terrain in a blizzard operate under physical laws that determination alone cannot override, and the pace they could manage was slower than calculation required. And as the daylight drained out of the sky behind the storm clouds, she began to understand that 4 miles in these conditions was not 4 miles in any ordinary sense of the term. She had not spoken during the push, neither had he. All available energy went to forward motion and staying on the road and keeping the horses calm and oriented. The wind was coming from the northwest, which meant it was in their faces for the worst stretches and then, occasionally mercifully, at their backs. And the cold was the kind that moved through multiple layers of clothing, as if they did not exist and took up residence in the bones. She had not said anything when her hands stopped feeling the reins properly. She had not said anything when the shivering started, the deep, involuntary kind that was not about cold tolerance but about core temperature, her body making decisions independent of her will. She had not said anything because there was nothing useful to say, and Cole was doing everything that could be done about the situation. And saying something would not help. He had looked back at her in a lull between wind gusts and seen it anyway. He had pulled his horse up without a word, dismounted into the knee-high snow with a controlled economy that did not waste a single motion, walked back to where Prudence had stopped beside him. And before Adeline had fully processed what was happening, the coat was off his back and around her shoulders. He had not asked, he had not warned her, he had not offered in the sense of presenting it as a choice. He had simply done it, with the same directness he brought to everything, as if it were not a remarkable thing at all, as if stripping yourself to shirt sleeves in a Colorado blizzard and handing the only protection you had to someone else was just a practical adjustment to conditions. Then he had turned and started walking, because the horses needed to be led now rather than ridden, and she had sat on Prudence for 3 full seconds staring at the back of a man in a cotton shirt walking into a January mountain storm. And she had seen, in the moment before he turned his face back into the wind, that quiet, private, self-surprised smile. She had understood in that moment that whatever story she had been telling herself about Cole Vance, the story that featured him as a tool she was using to solve a problem, was no longer the story she was actually living. She had dismounted and taken Prudence's reins and started walking too. They made the way station in just under an hour. The way station was a substantial log structure maintained by a man named Cobb and his wife Margaret, who were the kind of people the high country produced in excess, capable, laconic, deeply hospitable in the manner of people who understood that hospitality in a mountain winter was not a social nicety, but a moral obligation. Cobb had the horses into the stable within 3 minutes of their arrival, and Margaret had Adeline into a chair by a roaring fire with a blanket around her shoulders and a hot cup of something that was equal parts coffee and whiskey and pure thermal salvation. Cole had come in from the stable after the horses were settled, and Margaret had taken one look at him, in his soaked cotton shirt with the ice crystals forming at his collar, and had said, with the magnificent lack of ceremony of a woman who had seen everything the mountains could produce, "There are dry things on the shelf in the back room. Go put them on before I have to bury you in spring." Cole had said, "Yes, madam," and gone. He came back in a thick wool shirt and dry trousers, and sat in the chair across the fire from Adeline, and accepted his own cup of the coffee and whiskey mixture, and they had sat for a long while in the warmth and the noise of the storm outside, and she had looked at him across the fire, and he had looked at the fire. "You could have told me you were cold," he said eventually, not accusatory, just observational. "So could you," she said. He looked at her then. A full look, not the cataloging sweep or the assessing glance, but a genuine, direct attention that she felt as a physical warmth separate from the fire. "I wasn't going to tell you I was cold," he said. "I know," she said, "because that would have been beside the point." "Yes." The point was that you were going to lose feeling in your hands and fall off your horse in a blizzard. I noticed you noticed, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. How long had you not been saying anything? About 40 minutes. Something shifted in his expression, something she could not quite name. It was not entirely comfortable, whatever it was. It had the quality of a man encountering something he had not expected and was not sure what to do with. You should have said something, he said, not harsh, just true. You were doing everything possible, she said. Saying something would not have added anything useful. I would have given you the coat sooner. I know. That is why I didn't say anything. He stared at her. She looked back at him with the calm patience of a schoolteacher who had spent 4 years waiting for children to arrive at correct conclusions. He put his coffee cup down and rubbed his jaw and looked at the ceiling and said, "That is the most stubborn and also the most considerate thing I have heard in a very long time." "They are not mutually exclusive qualities," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was not what she had expected. It was not a guarded or controlled sound, but a genuine one. Warm and a little rough, as if it came from a place that had not been used in a while and was surprised to find itself in operation. She felt it in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with warmth from the fire. They stayed at the way station for 2 nights while the storm blew itself out. Margaret, with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who had learned to make the most of having company, produced 3 excellent meals out of ingredients that should not, technically, have been capable of yielding 3 excellent meals, and presided over the evenings with the kind of conversational authority that made you want to be forthcoming whether you planned to be or not. She had learned from Cole in the course of the first evening that he had a younger sister in Virginia, who he had not seen in 6 years, but wrote letters to regularly. She had learned that he had opinions about the new land grant policies coming out of Washington that were considerably more sophisticated than his rough exterior suggested. She had learned that he had read, at various points in his wandering life, a startling quantity of books, and had views on Thomas Paine and Frederick Douglass that she found herself arguing with, and then agreeing with, and then arguing with again in a way that she had not done with anyone since her last year of teacher training, when her fellow students had been young and urgent and full of opinions, and she had been the same. Cole had learned from her, more gradually because he was naturally less forthcoming, that she had wanted to be a doctor at one point before the arithmetic had made teaching the only viable option. That she had a complicated relationship with optimism, which she considered necessary, and also somewhat irresponsible if not anchored to real conditions. That she could navigate by stars, which was not a skill typically associated with schoolteachers in Wyoming, but which her father had taught her before his death, and which she had maintained as a private inheritance. On the second evening, with Margaret and Cobb retired early and the fire burning down to comfortable coals, he had said, suddenly and without preamble, "The situation in Denver City is manageable, but it will require a degree of trust that I want to be honest about." "All right," she had said. "There are people I need to contact who operate outside the law in ways that are functional but not comfortable to be adjacent to. You will need to trust that I know what I'm doing and not ask questions about every interaction that doesn't look clean." "I can do that," she had said. "You're not a woman who doesn't ask questions," he had said. "No, but I'm a woman who understands when asking questions will get in the way of a necessary process. I will trust your judgment on operational matters. I will not trust blindly. If something looks like a genuine betrayal of the purpose we've agreed on, I will say so." He had nodded. "That is fair." "I need something from you in return," she had said. He had raised his eyebrows very slightly. I need you to tell me if the situation changes in a way that affects Thomas's safety. I need to know the real landscape, even if it's worse than you would prefer to tell me. Do not manage my feelings by managing my information." He had looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was something she identified, with a small and slightly dizzying internal shift as respect. Genuine and uncomplicated respect. "Agreed," he had said. They had reached Denver City 4 days later, traveling the lower roads that the storm had left passable if not comfortable, stopping at ranches and settlements along the way where Cole seemed to know, specifically and by name, approximately one person in every 5 that they encountered. She had watched him work through these networks with the same economy and precision he brought to everything, extracting information and depositing goodwill with a natural social competence that seemed at odds with his fundamental solitude. She had noted this observation and filed it as a question to return to later. Denver City, in January 1878, was a city in the process of deciding what it was going to be. It had the bones of ambition, wide streets laid out in confident grids, brick buildings beginning to replace the wooden storefronts of the earlier boomtown era, a rail connection that brought the world's commerce within reach. It had also the rougher textures of its origins, saloons and boarding houses, and the particular quality of transient population that characterized places people were moving through rather than to. Men with their futures in front of them and their options still open. Cole had arranged a room at a modest hotel near the freight depot, which he paid for from his own pocket before she could object, and then looked at her in a way that preempted the objection she was already forming. "Your $40 needs to go further than a hotel bill," he had said. "This is a business expense." "I will repay you," she had said. "I know you will," he had said without condescension, just factual agreement, and had gone to arrange his meetings. She had spent 2 days in Denver City writing. She had written the account of Thomas's situation that Cole had asked for, 10 full pages of closely detailed narrative that covered every date and name and circumstance she knew, constructed with the same rigor she brought to explaining a mathematical proof, each step building on the last. Nothing assumed, nothing ornamental, everything essential. She had also, on an instinct she could not entirely explain, written a second document, a broader account of the pattern of Judge Fenwick's relationships with the mining operations in his circuit, drawing on everything she had learned in conversation with Cole and Hector at the trading post, and pieced together from her knowledge of Thomas's letters. When she had given Cole both documents, he had read them in silence, and when he finished he had looked up at her with an expression that was, she thought, as close to being visibly moved as she suspected he was capable of being in a public space. "This is excellent," he had said. "The second document, both, but the second one particularly. This is the kind of evidence presentation that makes a federal inspector's case move faster." She had experienced a satisfaction so profound it was almost physical. "I thought it might be useful to contextualize Thomas's situation within the broader pattern." "It's more than useful," he had said, and then, quietly, not as information but as something more considered, "You are very good at this." She had not said thank you. She had said, "I know. It's what I was trying to tell you in the beginning." He had done that thing again, the thing where he looked at her for a moment longer than strictly necessary, and something moved in his eyes that was too complex to categorize. Then he had gone to deliver the documents. The meeting with Harold Briggs's intermediary had happened the following morning, in the back room of a dry goods store on the eastern edge of the commercial district. And Adeline had not been there for it, because Cole had judged, correctly, that fewer people in the room meant less complication. She had waited at the hotel and tried to work on a letter to her mother, and found that she was entirely unable to think about anything except what was happening in the back room of the dry goods store. Cole had come back at midday. He had sat down in the chair across from her, and he had said, "Briggs is interested." The second document was what opened the door. "He's been building toward Fenwick for 18 months, and your account of the pattern of his mining relationships adds material he didn't have. He's willing to use Thomas's case as a specific instance to precipitate a formal inquiry, which means Thomas would be transferred to federal jurisdiction and out from under Fenwick's direct authority within the week." She had felt the room do something complicated and dimensional. "Within the week," she had said. "Best estimate. Briggs works carefully because he needs his cases to hold together." "That is the right way to work," she said. Her voice was entirely steady, which surprised her. "You've been holding yourself together for a long time," Cole said quietly. "Since I was 8, she said. "I know," she looked at him. "Thomas is going to be all right." "He is going to be all right," Cole confirmed. She had cried then. Not theatrically, not in the way of someone performing grief or relief, but in the quiet, inarticulate way of a person whose body finally has permission to acknowledge what it has been carrying. She had put her hands over her face and cried for maybe 2 minutes, and Cole had not said anything at all, had simply stayed in the chair across from her and waited, which was, she thought later, precisely the right thing and also the thing almost no one would have thought to do. When she lowered her hands, he had a handkerchief extended toward her, plain cotton, very clean. "I did not expect to cry," she said, taking it. "It would have been alarming if you hadn't," he said. She had laughed at that, a slightly wet and unsteady laugh, and he had looked at her with something undefended and wondering in his face, something he did not seem to know he was showing. While they waited for Briggs's machinery to move, they had been in Denver City for 9 days, and in those 9 days the story between them had developed the way stories develop, when two people are in proximity with nothing to do but exist alongside each other, and the existing turns out to be, against all expectation, genuinely enjoyable. They had explored the city. Cole had shown her the parts that the hotels and the main commerce didn't advertise. The Chinese Quarter with its bustling density, and the particular injustice of a community that was doing half the building and infrastructure work of the city, and receiving a fraction of the rights. The area east of the rail depot, where the freed black settlers had built their own self-sustaining commercial block against enormous political resistance. He had talked about these things with an unflinching directness that was not performative but simply honest. The observations of a man who had looked at the actual world rather than the official version of it. She had told him about Laramie, the specific texture of her life there, the children who were becoming capable of things they didn't yet know they could do, the quiet satisfactions of work that mattered even if it didn't pay enough. She had told him things she had not told anyone, not because they were secrets exactly, but because the daily architecture of her life didn't often include someone who would receive them with genuine interest. The fact that she wrote letters to Frederick Douglass's newspaper. The fact that she had taught herself some rudimentary Spanish from a grammar book, because half her students' parents spoke it, and she thought it was more logical for her to learn their language than to demand they function exclusively in hers. He had listened to that last one with a particular quality of attention. "You taught yourself Spanish," he said, "enough to be useful, not enough to be fluent." "Why?" he had asked, not skeptically, genuinely curious. "Because those children deserved a teacher who was trying as hard as they were," she had said, "and because it seemed like the right direction of effort." He had not said anything for a moment. Then he had said, "The world would be better with more thinking like that." "The world would be better with more of a lot of things," she had said, "but we have to start somewhere." He had looked at her again in that way, the way she was beginning to recognize as specifically about her and not about the general world, and she had felt the specific warmth of being genuinely seen, which was different from being looked at and substantially more significant. They had gone to dinner twice, at a modest restaurant near the hotel where the stew was excellent and the proprietor's wife played piano in the evenings, not professionally but with great sincerity. On the second evening, the piano player had shifted from the hymns and popular songs of her usual repertoire into something slower and more deliberate, and Cole had looked across the table at Adeline with his gray-green eyes in the lamplight and said, "I should tell you something." She had put down her fork. "All right. I find your company considerably more difficult to be without than I anticipated when you sat down across from me in the trading post." The room had felt very still. "I find yours the same," she said. He looked at the table, then at her. "I'm aware that I am not an obviously good prospect," he said. "I have a wanted poster with my name on it and no fixed address, and a history that is complicated in ways that would require time to fully explain. I am a school teacher with $40 and a rented horse," she said. "I don't think either of us is in a position to be particular about prospects." His mouth moved toward that smile. "I am not a man who says things I don't mean," he said. "So I want to be careful to say exactly what I mean." "Please do," she said. "I mean that I would like the opportunity, after Thomas is settled and you have time to think about it without the pressure of this situation, to know you better, to be around you, to see where that goes." She had looked at him across the table in the lamplight with the piano playing something slow and the warmth of the stew and the 9 days of Denver City behind them. And she had thought about the wanted poster in her coat pocket that she had never taken out. And she had thought about the coat he had put around her shoulders in the blizzard. And she had thought about the way he listened, and the way he talked, and the way he looked at the world. "I would like that too," she said. The word from Briggs came on the 11th day. Thomas had been transferred to federal custody, and the preliminary inquiry into Judge Fenwick's conduct had been formally opened. The charge against Thomas had been formally suspended pending the broader investigation, which Briggs's message indicated in language that was carefully official but unmistakably clear, was expected to result in the charge being dropped entirely within 2 to 3 months. Cole had come to the hotel with the message and handed it to her without preamble, and she had read it once and then handed it back, and he had read her face and said, "Yes, he's out." She had done something she had not planned. She had stepped forward and put her arms around him. He had gone very still for 1 second, the stillness of a man who has not been held in a long time and has to remember how to receive it. Then his arms had come around her, careful and then not careful, solid and warm and entirely present, and she had felt the steadiness of him and had thought, with a clarity that was almost startling, that she had not felt this safe in a very long time. "Thank you," she said into his shoulder. "You did most of it," he said, into her hair. "We did it," she said. "We did," he agreed. They had stayed like that for longer than was strictly necessary, and neither of them mentioned it afterward. She had traveled with a courier to the federal facility to see Thomas the following day. Cole had insisted on accompanying her, and she had been glad of it because the facility was on a mountain road that she would not have found easily alone, and because Thomas, when he came into the reception room, had looked at her with eyes that were older than she remembered, and she had needed someone beside her who was not going to fall apart. Thomas was thin. He was 23, and he had been thin to begin with, and now he was thin in the way of someone who has been under sustained stress, not dangerously so but unmistakably so. He had looked at Adeline and opened his mouth and closed it and looked at the ceiling. "I'm all right," he had said, which clearly included but was not limited to the proposition that he was crying in a federal receiving room and was trying to be dignified about it. "I know you are," she had said, and put her arms around him. Over his shoulder she had looked at Cole, who was standing in the doorway with the quiet self-effacing awareness of someone who understood that this moment was not his, and who was there if he was needed and invisible if he was not. He had looked back at her and given a small, barely perceptible nod that meant something she understood without words. She had introduced them afterward. Thomas had looked at Cole with the particular assessing attention of a younger brother evaluating a man in his sister's vicinity, and Cole had met the assessment with a complete lack of defensiveness that was itself informative. "You got her out of the blizzard," Thomas had said. This was based on the account Adeline had given him, which was accurate but partial. "She got herself through the blizzard," Cole said. "I was adjacently useful." Thomas had looked from Cole to Adeline and back. He was thin and tired and still clearly shaken from 3 months in a territorial jail, but his eyes were sharp, and he had their father's habit of seeing the thing behind the surface presentation. "All right," he had said, apparently arriving at a conclusion. They had stayed for 2 hours, and Adeline had told Thomas everything that was happening with the federal investigation, because she had promised herself, standing in Laramie with the letter in her hand, that she would never manage his feelings by managing his information either. He had listened with the careful attention she remembered from their shared childhood, asking precise questions, and absorbing the answers with the focused intelligence that had always been there waiting for the world to give it something worthwhile to work on. When they had left, riding back down toward Denver City in the thin winter sun that had arrived like an apology from the weather, Cole had said, "He's going to be fine." "He is," she had agreed. "He's like you." "He's better than me," she had said. "He got all of our mother's warmth and most of our father's humor and enough of my stubbornness to survive, which is the optimal combination." Cole had ridden in silence for a moment. Then he had said, "Your mother is lucky to have the 2 of you." It was a simple thing to say, and he said it simply, and she had felt it settle into her chest and take up permanent residence. The arrangements for Thomas's eventual release were proceeding through proper channels, which meant it would be another several weeks before he was formally free to travel. The federal inquiry would take its months. Justice, when it moved carefully and sometimes slowly, and Adeline had made her peace with the timeline because the outcome was not in doubt. She had also, standing in the hotel in Denver City with Cole on the evening after visiting Thomas, had to make a decision about her own timeline. She had school to return to. She had children waiting. She had a rented horse named Prudence, who was presumably still at the livery stable and accumulating fees. She had a life in Laramie that was real and valued and hers. She had also, standing in the hotel in Denver City with Cole, a person beside her who was becoming something she had not planned for and was not sure she could accurately quantify. "I have to go back," she had said. "I know," he said. "My students have been without their teacher for almost a month." "I know. The train from Denver City goes north to Cheyenne on Thursdays. Thursday is the day after tomorrow," he said. "Yes." He was not looking at the map this time. He was looking at her. "I'll ride with you to the station," he said. "Cole," she said. "Adeline," he said. And then, because he was a man who said what he meant and not more, "Tell me what you need from me right now." She looked at him in the lamplight. The lamp was the same kind as the one in her rented room in Laramie, the same oil, the same warm, inadequate light, but the room felt entirely different. She felt entirely different in it. "I need to know if this is something that continues," she said. "Not a hypothetical, not a possibility." I need to know if you are the kind of man who pursues a thing once he's identified it as worth pursuing." "Yes," he said, without hesitation or qualification. "I live in Laramie and you live in Redstone Flat, and they are not close to each other." "No," he said, "but distances are not fixed things. They can be changed." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is the most hopeful thing I have heard you say." "I am not generally optimistic," he said. "I know. That is what makes it meaningful." He had crossed the room then, not hurrying, not dramatic, just the same direct and purposeful movement he brought to everything. And he had taken her hand in both of his, which were warm and calloused and careful, and he had said, "I have been trying to figure out what I was looking for in this country for a long time. I did not expect to find it sitting across a sticky table in a trading post in January." She had looked at their hands, then at his face. "I came here to find someone to help my brother," she said. "I did not expect to find someone who made me want to stay." He had kissed her then. Gently, with the care of someone handling something precious. And she had kissed him back with none of her ordinary restraint, because she had made a decision, and she did not believe in half measures. The ride to the train station had been quiet and cold, and she had not minded the cold at all. He had helped her onto the train platform and handed up her bag and stood on the platform looking at her in the window with his hat in his hand and the December sun behind him. And she had pressed her hand flat against the cold glass, and he had nodded, one serious and deliberate nod, and then the train had moved. She had cried for exactly 15 minutes, and then dried her eyes and thought about what came next. What came next unfolded over the following months with the slow and certain inevitability of something that was always going to happen, finding the right conditions to begin. Cole wrote letters. This surprised her, because he was a man of economical speech, but it turned out that in writing he expanded into something that was almost lush, dense with observation and dry wit and occasional passages of startling beauty. When he was describing the high country in different seasons, or the specific quality of light on mountain snow at particular times of day. He wrote every 2 weeks without fail, long letters on good paper, and she wrote back at equal length and with the same frequency. And the correspondence became, through the winter and into spring, the best part of her weeks. Thomas was released in March, formally cleared of all charges, as Briggs had predicted. He went back to Nevada for a short time to collect his belongings and settle his affairs, and then came home to Laramie, thin still but less so, and sat at their mother's table, and ate her cooking with the focused application of a man making up for 3 months of institutional food, and was, within 2 weeks, recognizably himself again, which was the best possible outcome. Their mother had read one of Cole's letters over Adeline's shoulder one evening in April and said, with the precise efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years observing the world and drawing accurate conclusions, "When is he coming to Laramie?" "He is coming in June," Adeline had said. "Good," her mother had said, and gone back to her mending. Cole arrived in Laramie on a Wednesday in early June on a horse that was not the black gelding but a fine bay that he had purchased. He explained, because the black had developed a joint problem that made long travel inadvisable, and he was not a man who ran an animal past its capacity for the sake of his own convenience. The bay's name was Senator, which was a name he had inherited from the previous owner, and which Cole considered ridiculous, but was too established to change. She had met him at the livery stable. He was thinner than she remembered, which she noted with alarm, and had the look of a man who had been working hard and sleeping adequately, but not quite enough. He had looked at her for a long moment, and then said, "You look exactly like I remembered." "You look like you have not been eating regularly," she said. "I have been eating regularly," he said, "just not always well." She had taken him to her mother's house for dinner, which was an enormous commitment of domestic artillery that her mother had assembled with the quiet determination of a woman who understood that certain things had to be established early and clearly. The meal was roast chicken and 3 kinds of vegetables and fresh bread, and a pie that represented, by Adeline's estimate, 4 hours of deliberate effort. Cole had eaten with the focused gratitude of a man who knew exactly what 4 hours of deliberate effort looked like, and what it meant that it had been directed at him. And he had helped clean up without being asked, and he had talked to their mother with the complete and unpretentious attention he brought to everyone he actually respected. And he had thanked her at the end of the evening with a specificity that showed he had been paying genuine attention to the meal and not just consuming it. After he left, their mother had looked at Adeline and said, "All right," which was high praise. He had stayed in Laramie for 3 weeks, renting a room at the boarding house 2 streets over, and in those 3 weeks something had shifted between them from possibility into certainty. She had shown him her school, which was a small, bright room with 24 children who were, that June, finishing the year with a demonstration of their mathematics and reading progress for any parents who wanted to attend. Cole had sat in the back of the room while the children performed their demonstrations, and she had been aware of him the whole time, the way you are aware of something that has become important to your internal compass. And when she looked back at him at the end, he was watching her with an expression that was so uncomplicated and so warm that she had needed to look away to keep her professional composure. "They trust you completely," he had said after when the children were gone. "I trust them completely," she had said. "It goes both ways." He had looked around the small, bright room with its primers on the shelves, and the multiplication tables on the wall and the drawings that the children had tacked up along the window frame. "You built something real here," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did." "It would be wrong to ask you to leave it," he said. She had turned to look at him. "It would be wrong to assume you need to be the one who moves," she said. He had looked at her with those gray-green eyes in the June light coming through the schoolroom windows. "Laramie," he said slowly, as if hearing it for the first time as a possible word for where he was. "Laramie," she said. He had spent 2 more days thinking about it because he was not a man who made significant decisions quickly, which was one of the things she trusted about him. He had walked the town with the surveying attention he brought to unfamiliar terrain, mapping its rhythms and its people and its relationship to the surrounding land. And she had given him the space to do it, because she understood that he needed to arrive at his own conclusion through his own process. On his last evening before he had planned to return to Colorado to settle his remaining business there, he had come to her mother's front porch, where she was sitting with a book in the long June evening, and he had sat down beside her in the other chair and said, "I think Laramie could work." "I think you could work in Laramie," she said. "I know people who need documents drafted and cases made for them in legal language they don't have," he said. "I have been doing that work informally for years. There might be a way to formalize it." "I think there is," she said. Laramie has been growing fast. The rail connection has brought new people and new disputes, and the existing legal structure is not entirely keeping up. Someone who knows the territory and knows the people and can navigate both official and unofficial channels could find a great deal of useful work. He had looked at her sideways. "You have been thinking about this." "I am a woman who thinks ahead," she said. "I know," he said, and reached over and took her hand. They had sat on the porch in the June evening until it was dark, which was very late in June in Wyoming, and talked about the practical architecture of a shared life with the same direct and honest approach they had brought to everything else. There were complications to acknowledge, the wanted poster that would need resolving properly, the question of what a man like Cole Vance, did with his past in a town that was building its future. There were also, she had pointed out, remedies for those complications that she had been thinking about, including the possibility of formally petitioning Marshal Tully in Denver City to close the Hargrove warrant on the grounds that the original dispute had been resolved to the land-owning family's satisfaction, which it had. The widow and her children were still on their land. Cole had looked at her when she laid out the plan. "You wrote this out," he said. "I made some notes," she admitted. He laughed again, that warm, rough sound that still did things to her chest, and then he looked at her with something so open and uncomplicated in his face that she thought she would like to look at it for a very long time. "Adeline," he said. "Cole," she said. "I love you," he said. Simple, direct, as clear as everything else he said. No performance, no elaborate construction, just the plain statement of a plain fact as he understood it. She had not expected to feel the words arrive the way they did, which was not as words exactly but as something that settled into the space around her heart and made itself at home with the confidence of something that had always been going to be there. "I love you," she said back. He had kissed her in the evening dark on her mother's porch, and she had kissed him back with everything she had. He returned to Colorado for 2 months to settle his life there with the methodical care he brought to all practical matters. He wrote letters, long ones, full of the mountain observations and the dry humor and the specific quality of attention that she had come to understand was his particular form of intimacy. The way he showed you that you were in his thoughts by showing you what his thoughts looked like. Marshal Tully in Denver City had, as Adeline had predicted, been entirely willing to close the Hargrove warrant on the basis of a formal petition from the widow herself, a woman named Clara Nash, who had written a letter so full of quiet dignity and plain testimony that even Tully, a man not given to sentiment, had processed the paperwork the same week he received it. Cole returned to Laramie in September, with Senator the bay horse and 2 saddlebags and a wooden crate of books that he had not been willing to leave behind, and he rented a proper office on the main commercial street and began the work of establishing himself as someone people could bring their complicated situations to and expect to be helped. He was exceptionally good at it. He knew the territory and the people and the pressure points of the system, official and unofficial, and he had the particular combination of blunt honesty and genuine care for outcomes that made people trust him quickly and find that the trust was warranted. Within 6 months, he had more work than he could handle comfortably and had begun talking about whether hiring an assistant was financially viable. Adeline had continued teaching because she was exceptional at it, and because the children of Laramie needed her, and because there was no reason in the world that having found the person she wanted to spend her life with should require her to stop being who she was. Cole had never suggested otherwise. It was one of the things she loved about him. They were married in March in the spring of 1879, in a ceremony at the Laramie Community Church that was small and specific and entirely them. Thomas stood for Cole, which was the right choice, the two of them having developed, over the intervening months, the particular friendship of men who have been assessed and found mutually satisfactory. Cole's sister, Elizabeth, had made the train journey from Virginia, which had been a revelation to Adeline because Elizabeth was warm and funny and had Cole's eyes and a completely different approach to deploying them. And she had embraced Adeline on the train platform with the comprehensive enthusiasm of someone who had been hoping for something like this for her brother for a long time. Their mother had worn her best dress and cried for 20 minutes before the ceremony and then been entirely composed throughout it, which was a sequence of events Adeline recognized as deeply characteristic. The ceremony itself had been simple. The minister had said the words and they had said theirs. And Cole's voice had been steady and direct as always, and his eyes had been on her face the entire time. And when he put the ring on her finger, his hands had been completely still, and she had thought about those same hands extending a coffee canteen to her first in the cold morning at the trading post, and folding a coat around her shoulders in the blizzard, and taking her hand on the porch in the June dark. They had danced at the celebration afterward, which was held in the community hall that smelled of pine and was heated by 3 stoves and filled with the specific warmth of people who liked each other being glad about something together. Cole was not a natural dancer, but he was a competent one, applying the same quiet economy to movement on a dance floor that he applied to everything else. And she had put her hand on his shoulder and looked up at his face, and he had looked down at her, and the music had seemed, for a moment, entirely secondary. "We did this," she said. "We did," he said. "From a sticky trading post table," she said. "And a blizzard," he said. "And a coat," she said. He had looked at her with those complicated gray-green eyes and said, "I would have walked barefoot in that storm for you." "I know," she said. "That is exactly why I did not let you know sooner that I was cold." He had laughed and pulled her slightly closer, and they had danced until the musicians went home. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, with work and difficulty and ordinary joy, and the kind of deep daily satisfaction that does not announce itself dramatically, but accumulates, without fanfare, into something that constitutes a life. Their first child was born in December of 1880, a boy with Cole's jaw and Adeline's eyes, and a personality that announced itself from the first moments as determinedly individual. They named him Franklin, which was Adeline's father's middle name, and which Cole had agreed to with the simple directness of a man who understood that some decisions were about honoring what had come before. Franklin Vance was, from the beginning, exactly the kind of child who makes his parents simultaneously exhausted and astonished, curious about everything and fearless in the particular way of children who have grown up in the presence of parents who model curiosity and courage as natural states. Thomas, who came to visit from Nevada, where he had returned to work, but now in a proper engineering position at a mine that was operated by people who believed in paying their workers and keeping records, was spectacularly good with Franklin, which Adeline observed with the satisfaction of someone whose deepest predictions about her brother's character had been confirmed. Their second child came 3 years later, a girl with a quantity of dark hair and her father's stillness and her mother's stubborn jaw, who they named Clara, for the widow who had written the letter that closed the warrant, because some debts are best paid in the form of memory. Cole continued his work, which had grown into something substantial and recognized in the territory. He had 2 assistants by this point, one of whom was a young man named Marcus, who had been unable to find legitimate legal work because of his background, and who Cole had hired on the basis of a single conversation in which Marcus had demonstrated in the space of 20 minutes that he was both intelligent and honest, which Cole considered the only 2 qualifications that actually mattered. Adeline continued teaching, and then, in 1884, she stopped teaching and started something that was simultaneously terrifying and exactly right. She opened it in a building that Cole had helped her negotiate the lease for, and she taught the first classes herself, and within the first year, she had 2 additional teachers and more students than the building was designed for. She wrote letters to the Territorial Education Board. She wrote letters to the Federal Bureau. She wrote letters to Frederick Douglass's paper. She was, by general consensus in Laramie, a significant nuisance to the people who preferred things as they were, and a significant force of nature to everyone else. Cole, When journalists or officials or curious neighbors asked him about his wife's activities, said without any qualification or hesitation, "She is right, and the people who are upset about it are wrong. Those are the facts." He had given testimony before the territorial legislature in 1885 in support of expanded educational access, and the testimony was, by all accounts, extraordinary, dense with specific data and human testimony, and the particular combination of legal precision and moral clarity that had become his signature. Adeline had sat in the gallery and watched him and thought about a sticky table in a trading post in January and a blizzard on a mountain road. Franklin Vance, who was 5 in 1885, had decided that he wanted to be a doctor. He had announced this with the complete conviction of a small person who had thought it through carefully and arrived at a conclusion. And both his parents had received the announcement with the seriousness it deserved, which was to say entirely. Clara, who was 2, had announced no professional intentions, but had demonstrated an interest in her father's office that manifested as a habit of sitting on his desk and looking very seriously at documents she could not yet read. Cole had begun explaining to her, when she sat thus, the content of whatever he was working on, in language she mostly couldn't follow but to which she listened with great gravity. Adeline had stood in the doorway of Cole's office one October evening in 1885 and watched this, her husband at his desk and their daughter on it, listening to a patient explanation of a land dispute with the focused attention of a future, something not yet determined, and she had felt the whole weight and warmth of the life they had built together in the specific way that you sometimes feel it when you are not doing anything in particular, just standing in a doorway watching. Cole had looked up and seen her there. "How long have you been standing there?" he said. "Long enough," she said. He had smiled at her. Not the brief private smile she had seen first in the blizzard, though that one was still there and still did what it always did to her chest, but the full one, unguarded and warm and entirely for her. "Come in," he said. She had gone in. Clara had looked from one parent to the other with the evaluating attention of a child who was already very good at reading rooms, and arrived at the apparently satisfactory conclusion that everything was in order, and had gone back to looking seriously at the document in front of her. Cole had reached across his desk and taken Adeline's hand. Outside, the October wind came down from the mountains, and the lamps were lit in the houses of Laramie, and the train that ran north from Denver City sent its whistle up into the evening air, and everything that had been built, slowly and stubbornly and with great love, held. There was a moment, not long after, when Adeline found the old wanted poster. She had been going through a box of papers, the accumulated documentation of the preceding years, letters and legal filings and the children's early drawings, and there it had been at the bottom, folded the way she had folded it in her coat pocket in January of 1878. Cole Vance. Dangerous. Wanted. The crude sketch that had not done him justice in any direction. She had put it on Cole's desk without comment. He had looked at it for a moment. Then he had looked at her. Something moved in his face that was complicated and warm and entirely undefended. "I carried that for 3 weeks before I found you," she said, "and I never took it out of my pocket." "I know," he said. "How did you know?" "I saw you touch it through the fabric when I walked into the trading post," he said. Woman puts her hand in her coat pocket and holds on to something without taking it out. She's either protecting something important or carrying something she's not sure she wants to use yet. "You knew the whole time," she said. "I figured it was Lester's doing," he said. "He thinks in those terms. I thought you would either decide to try to use it at some point or decide not to, and either way I wanted to know what the deciding looked like." "And what did it look like?" He reached across the desk and touched her face, which he did with the same care and the same economy that he brought to everything, nothing wasted, everything genuine. "Like the right decision," he said. She covered his hand with hers. "What do you want to do with it?" He picked up the poster. He looked at it for one more moment. Then he folded it and put it in the wood stove. She watched it go. "The year I spent looking for something worth staying for," he said, "was the year I found you." "I came looking for help for my brother," she said, "and you found it." "I found considerably more than I was looking for," she said. Outside, Franklin came running through the yard with the energy of a 6-year-old who had discovered something urgent and interesting and needed to tell his parents about it immediately. Clara, inside, said something in the imperious and precise tone of a toddler who had decided she had been ignored long enough. Adeline felt Cole's chest move with a quiet laugh. "We should go," he said. "We should," she said. But neither of them moved for another moment, just stood in the warmth of the office with the sounds of their children around them, and the mountains somewhere north and west, and the long road behind them. All of it. The storm and the coat and the blizzard and the sticky table and the $40 and the wanted poster and the letter and Denver City and the dancing and the porch and the June dark. All of it accumulated into this one held moment. Then they went. And they kept going every day, side by side and forward, building the life that had begun when a gruff man in a mountain blizzard had stripped his coat from his own shoulders and put it on a stubborn woman's and walked the rest of the way into the frozen dark, smiling, as if he had already somehow known how it would all turn out.